This off. We are recording this session, just to make sure everyone is aware of that. Again, my name is Rob Gonda. I'm the Vice President of the Ohio Middle Level Association. And if you are here tonight, you are joining us for another wonderful virtual professional development tonight with Dr. Sierra Austin King, and I'll introduce her here in a second. I do want to mention a couple things coming up. One, we do have a survey going out to all members and actually all middle school teachers and administrators. We are in the process of doing some strategic planning, and we would love to get your opinion about what we can do to support you at the classroom and building level. And so we'll be sending more information out with this recording after the session. Well, please take a couple minutes to give us some feedback on that. Additionally, if you stick with us throughout the session, we are doing a giveaway. I think we have, Josh, I don't know, is it Chipotle gift cards tonight? What are we giving away tonight? Chipotle gift cards. So some incentive to stick with us to the end. We'd love to be able to give some things away to those who are in attendance tonight. Additionally, we also want to thank our partners. In particular, we want to thank tonight Franklin Covey. If you see on the slideshow, I think it's coming up here in a second, there is a giveaway there for one of their books. And again, all you have to do is email Andrea, and she will also answer the question about what the average ticket price for the Super Bowl. I gotta say, it's probably pretty expensive. So that's a nice little trivia question for you. So I think that's all of our announcements. Again, we hope that you will be able to join us as we continue to have these each month. Next month in March, we will have Jack Breckmeyer joining us, talking a little bit about middle level, the funny and the serious. And so we'll hopefully be able to join us for that session. And as always, we are hoping to see everyone in Columbus in the fall for our state conference. Again, more information will be sent out on that after tonight's session. So joining us tonight, I got the pleasure to introduce Dr. Sierra Austin King. Sierra is the ESC's Regional School Improvement Coordinator for Equity and Diversity. Is a graduate of the Department of Women and Gender Studies at The Ohio State University with a focus on race and social justice. Tonight, Sierra is going to be sharing a little bit about building capacity for courageous conversations. Sierra, thank you so much for being here tonight. I'll stop sharing. So if you would like to share anything with us, thank you so much for being here and leading us through this session.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me again. I'm going to share my screen. If at any point at all I get choppy or my Wi-Fi seems slow, please send me a message or Rob or John a message. We have some tablets and laptops going upstairs this evening, so Wi-Fi is probably stretched to its capacity. So again, if anytime you feel like I'm not coming in clear, please don't hesitate to let us know and I'll make some adjustments. So thank you, Rob, for the presentation of the introduction. I really appreciate it. It's good to be back. But I just wanted to start off with some housekeeping stuff. So usually, I think this is maybe the third time I've seen this group. And usually when you all see me, it's because things are like tough and complicated and tricky, right? So I just want to remind us to strive to cultivate a courageous space, right? So we're going to be talking about issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that means oppression, it means inequity, it means marginalization, and all the things that should make each and every one of us uncomfortable, right? So we're going to strive to cultivate that courageous space. You might hear terms like cultivating a safe space, which is a little different than a courageous space. So a safe space kind of guarantees that everyone's going to feel comfortable, everyone's going to feel safe. And that's not what I'm seeking to do here this evening, right? So to kind of get into the discomfort, right, and wrestle with that, you might have to do some negotiation around things that don't feel right, that don't feel good, and that's okay, right? So we're not guaranteeing that everyone can be safe, But I like to hopefully and ideally create a space where people feel courageous and brave enough to share and to talk and to ask critical questions. The next thing is honor multiple perspectives and avoid dichotomous thinking, right? So we're all coming from different backgrounds, different identities, different experiences. And so we all bring something unique to the table, right? So we want to honor that. If folks feel comfortable talking, whether that be by unmuting themselves or using the chat, either is fine. We just want to respect one another and realize that we're all on the journey to equity together in different places. The next few things, excuse me, are a bit more logistical. So just ask that you keep your mic muted to avoid ambient noise and feedback. I know it's evening, so there are probably lots of coworkers running around, which is totally fine. But if you need to say something or want to say something, feel free to pop off mute at any time. You should have the capability to do that. And of course, again, let us know if you experience any tech issues. You can send me a message, you can send Rob or John a message, but we want to make sure that you're able to hear and see us okay. And then lastly, take care of yourself. So again, it's been a long day. Just told Rob that I actually got to cook dinner tonight, which is amazing. It's kind of quiet around here. So if you want to leave that camera off, feel free to do that. If you need to get water, if you need to get food, if you need to talk to your coworkers, please feel free to do that. I'll make sure I'll make all the materials available so everyone has them after the presentation. All right. So I want to start us off with a framework called the Courageous Conversation Norms. And these norms are also known as the 4 Agreements. And they come from Glenn Singleton's Courageous Conversations About Race book, right? So these are things that are important to keep in mind as we progress through the conversation. So if you've attended before, these probably look familiar. So my apologies for the repetition, but just want to share them here. So the first thing is to stay engaged. And I know that can be hard. Again, it's late. We've got coworkers and this stuff isn't necessarily always fun to talk about, but just try to stay with us as much as you can. The second thing is to experience discomfort, right? So we're going to be talking about some things that we hear in the education world and the political sphere that we often hear as causing divisiveness, right? Or being troublesome or not useful or productive conversations to have. But they are, right? So if you experience that discomfort, that's okay. That happens to me sometimes too. Let's sit with it and try to unpack it and process it and kind of think about where it's coming from, right? And how do we kind of disrupt it? The third thing is to speak your truth. So again, we're coming from all different backgrounds, experiences, identities, and we appreciate all the perspectives that we can bring to the table tonight, just like you will appreciate all the perspectives that you might encounter in your classroom or your building when you're engaging in this work. And then number 4 is probably like the absolute most important one. We will not solve all of the DEI quandaries and problems and inquiries and all the stuff that we will talk about tonight, right? Because we know that this is built upon systems of oppression that have been around for like centuries, right? And so we won't solve all the world's ills tonight, and that's okay. So just accept and expect the absence of closure and know this can be like a starting off point or just a continuation point for work that is important for us to do, right? Even though we might not see all of the fruits of our labor in our lifetime, right? Thinking about our children, our students, our future students, and really how we want to create equitable buildings and equitable districts and equitable communities, right? It takes a long, long time. So any questions about the norms? Maybe a norm we want to add, something that's missing, something that's like, Sierra, I don't really like that. That's fine too. All right, well, we'll keep going. So because it's late and it's dark, I thought we'd do an icebreaker. I hope it's fun. It's not the traditional stuffy icebreaker, but this is just to kind of loosen us up a bit. I'm gonna do a little Kahoot. So if you have a phone, near you, another device of any kind that you can log into kahoot.it, kahoot.it, so that's KAHOOT.it, to do a little icebreaker on Black History Month, since we're in the middle of February. So if you have any problems with kahoot.it, you can send me a message or send Rob or John a message. I'm gonna see our game pin loading here on the screen. Once you've gone to kahoot.it, of course, you just pop that pin number into the screen, and then you put your name into our lovely system here. So you can use a first name, you can use a middle name, you can use a last name. I used to tell my students you can use anything that is not grossly inappropriate. And again, feel free to leave those cameras off. Just want to get us engaged and excited. Looks like we've done this before, which is cool. Give it a couple more seconds. Again, if you have any issues, please let us know. You can also use that QR code. Just open your camera app, put it in front of that QR code, and that'll get you where you need to be too. Give it a couple more seconds. Right. If you need some additional assistance, please type it in the chat or unmute or forever hold your peace. All right, get started. All right, so again, the topic is Black History Month. Right. Got 20 seconds to answer each question. Negro History Week was created by Carter G. Woodson in what year? What year? (1926) is the correct answer. So it looks like most people got that right. That's awesome. All right. Got some activity on the scoreboard. Let's get it, Sarah. Number 1. All right, question 2. What NBA player founded the I Promise School in Akron, Ohio? If you need some more context, this was 2018, not too long ago. Everybody got that right. LeBron James. Awesome, awesome. All right, we got some disruption on the scoreboard. Jen coming in at first place now. All right, hip hop music was birthed in what decade? So all of y'all that were tuned into the Super Bowl halftime show, tell me when that stuff originated. What decade was that? 1970s. Looks like most of us got that. All right. All right, Rob, I see you. In what city did hip hop originate? We've got 1970s. Black and Latino youth need an outlet to talk about systemic oppression. They want to talk about racism. They want to talk about poverty. Started in New York by Black and Latino youth who were making critical analyses about identity, oppression, politics, and needed an artistic outlet. That's where hip hop comes from. So it has social justice origins, although we don't always see that contemporarily. We know it started from a social justice kind of lens background. All right, little disruption here. Rob's still in the first place. Next question, who invented the traffic light? Where would we be without it? Who's pictured here? Garrett Morgan. See, most of us got that right. Awesome. All right. Looks like Josh is the highest climber, though. He's coming for you, Rob. All right. The air conditioner was invented by a Black man. True or false? The photo gives you a little hint here. Everyone said true. All right. Air conditioner was created by a Black man, Frederick Jones. Anybody want to guess where he's from? You can unmute, drop it in the chat. Right here in Ohio, Cincinnati. All right. We'll keep going. Just a few more. Which two HBCUs are located here in Ohio? You pick one, you'll still get the points. If you pick the other, you'll still get the points. But we got two of them. Yeah, looks like we got this right. We've got Central State and Wilberforce, which are directly across the street from each other in Xenia, Ohio. All right. All right, next question. Who was the first Black woman entrepreneur to become a millionaire? First to become a millionaire. Most of us got it. That's Madam C.J. Walker, and she made her millions from hair care products. So that's like one of the few things during recessions historically that we know we don't see a decrease in spending in, right? We want to look good. So all the cosmetic stuff, all the hair stuff, stable no matter what's going on politically or economically. But yes, Madam C.J. Walker. All right, true or false? Rosa Parks was the first Black woman to refuse to give up her seat on a public bus, sparking the civil rights movement. Ooh, we got an even tie. 6 said yes, 6 said no. The correct answer is false. Rosa Parks was not the first, right? So there were, in fact, two women, Black women, who gave up their seat on the bus first. First was Pauli Murray. And if you haven't heard of Pauli Murray, you should check out Amazon Prime TV. There's a new documentary about her life, which is phenomenal. But she was a lawyer, a poet, a writer, also gender nonconforming, phenomenal attorney, so good person to know. Should say they. We think that their pronouns would be they, although they're deceased, we can't ask them. Their gender kind of queer identity fueled a lot of their motivation for their activism and their work. We try really hard to honor them with the pronouns that they think that they would use. Again, that documentary is called I Am Pauli Murray. And another person, another Black woman who sat on a bus and the intent to desegregate public transportation was Claudette Colvin. It was a 15-year-old African-American girl. And both Pauli and Claudette Colvin sat on a public bus with the intent to desegregate much earlier than Rosa Parks. So not a lot of people know that. All right. We got one more question. This is the last one. Juneteenth is celebrated on what day in June? Is it the 16th, 17th, 18th, or 19th? Now a federal holiday. What day is it celebrated on? The correct answer is June 19th, right? So that is also known as the Black or African American Independence Day, when enslaved Africans were made aware in Galveston, Texas, that slavery was no longer legal. We celebrate that on June 19th. All right, so let's see where we kind of shook out with scores. We got John in third place. All right, John. Hope in second place, and at first place, we got Rob. I promise this was not rigged, and I did not share these questions with Rob today at the office by any means. So shout out to Rob. So thank you all for playing. Thought that might be a good way to kind of get us started tonight. So we'll keep on trucking along. Again, feel free to leave those cameras off if that's what feels comfortable. If you want to interrupt me at any time, please feel free to come off mute and also drop stuff in the chat, and we'll make sure your questions or comments get addressed. See some hate going on in the chat, but it's all good. All right, so we're talking about courageous conversations, and I think the kind of most fundamental question that we all have is, why is talking about race so hard, right? We have probably been engaged in more conversations about racism, inequity, police brutality, inequities in the criminal justice system in the last 2 years, and a lot of us have been in our entire lives, right? And so we've probably noticed, if this applies to you, that this has not gotten any easier over the course of the last 2 years plus, right, that we've been in this pandemic. So I want to talk about why it's so hard, right? Whether it be in our classrooms, in our buildings, with our coworkers, with our family members, with our parents, all of the things, right? Why is it so hard? So one of the reasons why it's so hard is that we've kind of been given this colorblind ideology, right? And so to define what that means is the belief that assumes that institutional racism and discrimination have largely been eradicated, right? So if you know someone who kind of operates by this principle, or maybe even you operate by this principle, it's this idea that, I don't see color, right? So we don't need to talk about race. We don't need to talk about racism. We don't need to talk about white supremacy, because everyone's the same and we don't see color, right? And so on the surface, that looks like something that an ally would say, or an activist, or an ally, right? But there's a problem with that. And so the problem with that is that it can lead to dismissal of social and cultural factors that still affect people of color or BIPOC folks, as well as the rejection of policies that attempt to address existing inequities, right? So when we say we don't see color, are we saying that we're not seeing and affirming folks' identities, their heritages, their cultures, and that we don't need to really address systemic or political issues for that reason, right? And we know that that's simply not true, right? So colorblind ideology might be a reason why it's so uncomfortable to talk about issues of race. Another reason is that for a very long time in this country, including during the civil rights movement, we've been talking about equality discourse, right? And so we're talking more about the difference between equality and equity, right? And so there's an image here that I just wanted to share to give you a visual. But when we're thinking about equality, we're thinking about how each individual or each social or political group of people gets the same thing, they get the same resources, they get the same opportunities, right? And while that probably sounds good without thinking about it too critically, it's problematic in a lot of ways, right? Conversely, when we think about things from an equity lens, we really get in there to see what each person or each political or social group really needs, right, to be successful, to achieve parity, right, to have fairness, right? So that means we allocate and exact resources and our opportunities in very, very specific ways based upon needs to reach equitable outcomes, right? So you can see here in this graphic, equality versus equity. And the equality part, you see everybody's got the same resources, the same level of access, but based upon their identities, and in this case, it's their height, we can see how something gets lost, right? Something gets missed when we don't pay attention to exactly what each individual person or student, coworker, or friend might need, right? So that's the difference between equality and equity, right? Another reason why it might be so difficult to talk about race is because of implicit bias, right? And we've heard that term a lot over the last 2 years or so. But implicit bias is a concept based on cognitive and neurological research that explores how we subconsciously organize information in our brains. I always like to say that we all have implicit biases, even me, right? We all do. They don't always solely have to do with race, right? They can do with gender. They can deal with sexual identity. They can do with gender identity. They can do with religion. They can do with socioeconomic status. So there are multiple categories of identity around which we can develop these biases. And again, we all have them, right? So the problem, obviously, with implicit biases is that it affects our attitudes and our actions, right? And so it affects how we engage with people, with students, each and every day, even if we aren't aware of it, right? So I always say and plug the Project Implicit work done by Harvard University. If you just Google Project Implicit or Implicit Bias Test, you'll get here and you can take an implicit bias assessment based upon race, as well as a ton of other categories of identity, and kind of gives you an idea of where you lie in terms of your biases, right? So no shame in wanting to take that assessment, no shame in wanting to take various forms of that assessment, because we, again, know that we all have biases, and the shame really lies in not knowing where they are or not doing anything to disrupt them. So highly, highly encourage everybody to use that tool to find out where your biases might be. When thinking about our biases, this is important to think about, right? So psychologists estimate that our brains are bombarded with approximately 11 million bits of information every second, right? And that's all of our senses. So that 11 million bits of information is sound, it's tactile responses to things, it is things that we might smell, things that we see, obviously, and we have triggers, right, that have to do with our memories and our own experiences. And so our identities and the experiences and the memories that we have help us make sense of all of the information that's coming at us really fast, right? So it's like our brain giving us a shortcut. And sometimes those shortcuts are rooted in bias, they're rooted in stereotypes, and they can be really harmful, right? So that's why we call it unconscious. So we don't do it purposefully, and it happens like so fast. There's been not a lot of time to think about it. So disrupting those biases is an active and ongoing process, right? That you have to be accountable for. Think about, why do I feel that way about this particular social group of people, this race of people, right? This class of people, this group of people that speaks this particular language, right? So you kind of have to work on disrupting it all of the time, right? Because truthfully, we get some pretty problematic messages from the media that we consume sometimes, maybe our friend groups, maybe our family groups. So it really can be like a difficult, long-lasting process of unlearning stuff, which is hard. Right? Another reason why it's so hard to talk about race is discomfort, right? So I addressed that in those kind of 4 agreements at the beginning of our session tonight. Nobody really likes to feel discomfort, right? So Glenn Singleton defines that as a combination of healthy tension that creates a slight emotional uneasiness, some cognitive dissonance, and inclination to push through whatever the issue is rather than shutting down, right? So thinking about competing interests, thinking about differing perspectives, and really trying to push through to think critically about who's in power here, who has less power, who has less agency, who is experiencing marginalization, right? So it takes time to do that, and it's often very uncomfortable. So you may have seen this graphic before. This is coming largely out of Ibram X. Kendi's work on anti-racism. It just kind of shows you different kind of levels or phases of discomfort that you might experience as you go through this journey. So take a look at that. Fear zone, learning zone, growth zone. Think about where you may exist here. You don't have to share that with us. Think about where you may exist. Think about where those closest to you may exist, where your colleagues may exist. Obviously, we want to be in the growth zone. Another reason it's difficult to talk about race is because it seems like we've been having these same conversations for a very, very long time, right? Us individually, perhaps our colleagues, perhaps our closest friends and families, members. Perhaps it's the authors that we read, the scholars that we engage with, the documentaries that we watch. I'm talking about race and racism in this country for a very long time. So, right, when is it going to end? Right? So that is a very valid question around fatigue. So I wanted to share this, and Rob, this might look familiar. This is coming from our YWCA training side. It's not like the best reproduction of the image, but I think it's really important. When we talk about race and racism, this is something that obviously has existed for much longer than any of us on this PD tonight. But this graphic kind of shows how it interconnects with almost every facet of life, right? So when you think about inequitable outcomes, yourself, your students, the people that you work with, this is the ways in which we and they, right, may be impacted. So obviously we see education, but we see income, right, and wealth disparities, right? We see housing. So we've probably heard of redlining and housing segregation in terms of DEI work. Think about health and healthcare and the social determinants of health. How when COVID was first starting, we were kind of honing in on communities of color, low-income communities who are more likely to maybe contract COVID because of pre-existing conditions like high blood pressure and high cholesterol and obesity, right? And so how that disproportionately impacts communities of color. Criminal justice system, right? Social norms and self-esteem. So just all the ways, right, in which it's hard to have conversations about race because we feel like there's nothing we can do. Because this is so pervasive and it is so complex and everything is like interconnected. So you see all these arrows here and they don't make sense and they're not necessarily supposed to make sense, right? Just trying to show how everything, right, is connected. So I'll pause here for a minute. Any questions thus far? Anything on here that doesn't make sense or anything that's like a aha moment for you? Okay, you can drop it in the chat or stop me at any time. I think we see something in the chat here. Will we get a copy of these slides? Absolutely. I'll try to make this one a little cleaner for you, but absolutely. So just wanted to share some additional information around hopelessness and talking about race and courageous conversations, why they have to be so courageous, because a lot of this is out of our control, right? So we know like a zip code can greatly impact a student's access to quality education, their health outcomes, obviously those social determinants of health, their self-esteem, and their interest in civic engagement and social justice and trying to create equitable outcomes. Right? We know that we can inherit vastly different circumstances based on race and ethnic identity, as well as socioeconomic status. So I can't say enough that these zip codes, unfortunately, are really, really accurate predictors of disproportionality, right? Which our students have no control over. And it's been that way for a long time. We've ruled it unconstitutional, but yet we see our funding greatly, very much tied to students' zip codes, right? So it's, again, that feeling of hopelessness, right? So vastly different circumstances based on racial and ethnic identity and socioeconomic status. And just want to point out there that you see a couple dimensions of identity in that bullet point. You see race and ethnicity, you see socioeconomic status. What's happening there is really important in that sentence. And what that sentence is doing is giving us an intersectional lens. So that's another term that we've been hearing a lot for like the past 2 years. But intersectionality simply means that we're not just looking at one category of identity. So we're not just talking about race, but we're also talking about socioeconomic status. Does the data look more dismal when we add ability or disability in there? Does it look more dismal when we talk about religious affiliation, right? Does it look more dismal when we talk about primary language? So all of the interventions that we come up with need to keep all of those things in mind, right? We've got to talk about how folks, students in particular, can experience multiple forms of oppression all at once, right? So we know a big part of this system that we're trying to disrupt and dismantle is systemic racism and implicit bias. And again, from that tricky web that we've weaved in this country over the last couple centuries, that it's literally a part of everything that we are involved in, right? So our banking practices, accumulation of wealth, our representation in popular culture, our representation in politics, our education system, et cetera, et cetera. There's nothing that this plague does not touch, right? And so the tricky thing about thinking about interventions or thinking about ways to disrupt is that no single person or entity is responsible. Things like really abstract and out there, and it makes it really, really a hard nut to crack, a hard problem to solve, right? You can't just kind of pinpoint one person or one corporation or one administrator, right? It's this really intricate web, right? All right, so when we're talking about courageous conversations, we often do so around framing about inclusivity and belonging, right? And those are generally talked about like in terms of feelings, right? They're like students feel good or they feel bad. We want students to feel welcome, et cetera. And that's important. Those are important conversations to have. But also it's important to know that whether someone feels like they belong or not has physiological consequences, right? So you could literally be shortening someone's lifespan in a space where they feel like they don't belong, right? So if someone feels like they don't belong because of who they are, that can be their race, their gender identity, their sexual orientation, their religious affiliation, their primary language, their, whatever, right? Chances are it's probably not the first time that they felt that way, and that they felt that way over the course of their lifespan, that they've been denied access to resources, that they've been denied access to opportunities, and that causes stress, right, on the body. So it increases cortisol and stress levels, and those are what we call physiological triggers that like happen multiple times daily sometimes, but consistently, and have a cumulative impact over time, right? So there's a constant a constant state of fear or anxiety. And again, linking this to those social determinants of health, right? So high blood pressure, right? Cardiovascular disease, stroke, heart attack, etc. And so we also know that feeling like you don't belong, right? Experiencing those implicit biases, those microaggressions, those systemic inequities the blatant racism, the implicit racism, all of that has a really damaging toll on the health of individuals, right? And actually decreases cognitive functioning, which is like a big deal, right? So if a student is trying to negotiate that in a space where they feel they don't belong, and they're constantly monitoring for threats, right? So I'm just hyper vigilant all the time. I'm worried about, is somebody thinking about, what my hair looks like? Am I wearing my hair, in a natural way? If my English is a little broken, right? Constantly monitoring those threats takes away from what students can do to perform in the classroom, or what adults can do to perform in the workplace, right? It's a huge, huge deal. You could be adding years literally onto someone's life by doing this work around having courageous conversations, right? So next question I want us to think about is, what's so courageous about this conversation? Hopefully that last part kind of gets you to thinking about the importance of this conversation, right? But the protocol that Glenn Singleton poses, which is those 4 agreements and some more stuff that I'll share over the next few slides, is meant to do the following, right? So it's meant to engage those who won't talk, right? Because again, this is uncomfortable. Or people might not feel that they know enough about racial issues or social justice issues. So we're often met with silence, right? So it kind of disrupts that. Sustains the conversation when it gets uncomfortable or diverted, right? So the protocol kind of gives us a way to stay on task and sit with the discomfort. And it deepens the conversation to the point where authentic understanding and meaningful actions can occur. Right. So this is a page directly from the textbook, and I will make sure that this is kind of shared in a better form, maybe a PDF, so that you can actually see this and the pages around this particular page. But this is what Glenn Singleton kind of says is required to have a courageous conversation. So just take a minute to look at that. So he's got anti-racism here, which is really cool to think about, because I think we became familiar with that term through Ibram X. Kendi's work, How to Become an Anti-Racist. But it's really cool that that Glenn Singleton was doing this work before that. So we've got anti-racism, equity and equality, we've got empowerment, right? We've got leadership as a part of this formula, community and parental engagement as a part of this formula, teaching and learning as a part of this formula. Also got critical race theory, which is a contentious topic, but really meant to get us to think about disparities and policies from a historical lens, right? Gets a lot of heat, but still very kind of useful analytic and useful approach for us. Adaptive leadership principles and systems thinking and tools, right? So Glenn Singleton's argument is that when we incorporate, right, these principles into our conversations, that we'll start to see a shift in the language that we use to talk about inequity, right? And so here are a couple of sentences, a couple of phrases you'll see in the traditional conversation column that you might hear or that you might have heard recently. Right. Give me a second to look at those. And what really thinking about things from an intersectional lens, keeping implicit bias in mind, thinking about power dynamics, what we really mean when we make these statements or when we hear these statements, right? You might notice that what you see in the traditional conversation column is more comfortable. It's a little easier to digest, a little more palatable. But he encourages us to make explicit kind of where the disparities lie, so we're confronting stuff head on, right? But anything anyone wants to say here?
Hey, Sierra, do you have any suggestions? We have, folks who will be watching this later and people who are on the call. And, I think every community, every school, it might be at a different stage at, where they're engaging with this topic or the many topics that are involved. Do you have suggestions for folks, where maybe to get even started with some of these difficult conversations? Maybe they're, someone who is, I really want to engage, but they're not getting a lot of traction. Any suggestions along that way?
So obviously Glenn Singleton's work is phenomenal. So that's easy to get. Barnes and Noble, Amazon, all the major retailers. That's a good place to start. I think I've shared in previous sessions, Learning for Justice, which is formerly Teaching for Tolerance, but it's now Learning for Justice. That's a good place to go to get some information on how to start these conversations, how to prepare yourself to start these conversations, even down to like sentence stems. So it gets like that in the weeds, which is helpful. That's Learning for Justice. And so those are two good ones. And I can share some more, Rob, when I share the PowerPoint, right? We've got a question in the chat. Can you briefly discuss terms like students of color, Black, Brown, African American versus Black? Sure. So African American versus Black, I'll start there. African American is specifically talking about folks who identify as Black and as American. So typically those are people who are descendants of slaves or enslaved persons, we should say, not just slaves, but enslaved persons to the United States, right? Black, however, can be anybody of the African diaspora, right? So that can be folks that I identify as Jamaican or Haitian or anyone who may have come from anywhere kind of across, ancestors came anywhere from across the continent of Africa. For African Americans, people that have been here for centuries, it's really hard for us to kind of trace our legacy in that way. And so that's where we get the term African Americans. As much as we can kind of trace back throughout time and history, our grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-great-great-grandparents have kind of been in the US for some time. Black is kind of just more expansive, doesn't just apply to African Americans, but people of the African diaspora more broadly. Which term is the most politically correct? That's a good question. I think generally they are kind of synonymous and interchangeable. But just keep in mind that if you're talking about Black, it can be more inclusive of just African Americans, right? So again, it could be Africans, Jamaicans, Haitians, etc. Black is being used more and more. Absolutely. The thing that I say around using Black, which is what I use and think is acceptable, is to capitalize it just so we affirm it as a racial and cultural identity. And so that's just kind of what I tell folks who ask that question, like Black is fine. Just that capital B is very important to a lot of us. So something to keep in mind. You might be hearing the term BIPOC more and more used interchangeably with people of color. So BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous People of Color. And that is just used as like a linguistic, I guess, hack that kind of makes us think about those different identities and the unique experiences that they have, right? So when we say like people of color, it kind of just like lumps everybody up into one kind of category, and we don't realize like the unique perspectives or histories or the nuance that lives in that space. So if we say BIPOC and we're like Black, Indigenous, people of color, that makes us kind of pause, right? And think about what does kind of each of these letters stand for? Why is that nuance important? How are their histories and identities and struggles different from one another, right? So in that people of color, if we say Black, Indigenous, people of color, that people of color part can include people of Asian descent, folks of Latino descent. You might be hearing the term Latinx or Latine, which is essentially kind of that Hispanic Latino demographic. So yeah, BIPOC just kind of forces us to kind of break them down, think about them on individual terms. None of those are slurs. None of those are identifiers that you should not feel comfortable using in your courageous conversation. So if you say Black, you say brown, you say people of color, you say Indigenous folks, you say Asian, none of that should get you into any trouble. Or need any type of restoration or repair of harm in any way. So I don't know if that was like lab. If it was, like, let me know and I can try to clear it up a little bit. I know it's late, so it might be like rambling on. So if that was not making sense, just let me know and I can try again. All right. So these courageous conversations, I know we're winding down on time, are important mostly in the context that we're talking about because of the achievement gap, right? The problem that scholars, researchers, teachers, parents, communities have been trying to figure out for a very, very long time. So when you think about those zip codes, right, that can determine our outcomes, that are very, very accurate predictors of how well students may or may not do academically. These are all the ways that it influences, right, the achievement gap. So start kind of with the student section, move to classroom, move to district, move to school. And you can see how all of these things can disproportionately impact students based upon who they are, right? Which they have no control over. That's a lot, right? Anything stick out in a good way or in a not so good way, excuse me, an uncomfortable way? But obviously we can see here that, yeah, it's a serious business. I've read research that states the achievement gap needs to be renamed as an opportunity gap. Absolutely, I like that language much better. So make that change here. That access and that opportunity, right? Or the lack of access and the lack of opportunity can't be overstated here. So thanks for that, Hannah. We didn't get the update in real time, but when we share the slides, it will say the opportunity gap. All right, so this is the reason why Glenn Singleton says it's important to use language that really specifies what we mean, right? So I'll go back to this slide, traditional conversation and the courageous conversation, right? So this is why it's really important to really use this language that may be uncomfortable, right? That may be saddening, disheartening, so we can really get at the crux of the problem, right? Because this is literally a list, and probably not a comprehensive list of what's at stake, right? So part of courageous conversations too is calling folks in. So you will probably hear and see some things that you're like, whoa, that is like woefully problematic. Why is this person using that language? Why are they talking in this way? It can be a colleague, it can be an administrator, it can be a parent, it can be a spouse, it can be a friend, it can be a family member, right? And so I think what's really important to think about when we're doing or engaging in courageous conversations, no matter the context, wherever you are, right, is that we want to do it in a restorative way, right? So again, a lot of people don't know where their biases are. A lot of people have been conditioned to think certain things from the TV they watch, the people that are around them, the people that love them, the people that raise them, to believe certain things, right? And so we really all need some grace, right, in disrupting these problematic ideas. So I talked about learning for justice and their sentence stems, but this is coming from what's called the Pocket Guide to Probing Questions. And this is just like some steps you can take to disrupt implicit bias or disrupt problematic statements that are kind of rooted in stereotypes about, folks that you can kind of use in real time, right? And so you can see the purpose of calling in, right? Rather than calling out and saying, you said this thing and that's not okay. And, we're canceling you, right? But calling in forces us to kind of reflect more deeply, right? To make meaning together, to talk through stuff and find a mutual sense of understanding, right? We use calling in as a restorative practice when we want to understand, like, what gives you that perspective? What makes you think that? Why did you say that, right? It helps us to think about different perspectives or possibilities or outcomes. It provides multiple perspectives, right, which we talked about at the very beginning of our session tonight. And it's focused on reflection, right, and not just reacting, right? We're getting people to kind of like slow down and like, man, I don't know why I thought that. I don't know why I said that, but I'm going to try to disrupt that in the future because that's not okay. And again, that can happen to any and all of us. So you can take a look here, see what's here. You may have said some of these things. Some of these things may have been said to you, and that's okay. So you can feel free to unmute or drop something in the chat if you have any thoughts about what you see here. Definitely helpful to see this. That's awesome. Because I know a lot of times this stuff seems, again, and I'm thinking about that web from the YWCA slide, like it's so deep and it's so complex. So I'm like, what are the small tangible things? Like if it's something that I need to hang up like at my desk, right, that I can look at and be reminded about inequity and my privilege, right? Those things are always super helpful. I really like that it's restorative and not confrontational. Absolutely. I am like the most non-confrontational person ever. Right? Need it. So there's a calling out version of this, but I don't even like that one, so I don't share just because it makes me anxious. So call in, call in. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing and share a link in the chat. And of course, I will make sure everyone has this. So we're right up at 8 o'clock. But hopefully that'll take you, let's see, to a link that looks like this. And so in addition to having like those tangible sentence starters or conversation kind of starters that you can use to disrupt and engage in courageous conversations, this is an equity tool that I really like. So it's essentially like a self-audit or assessment tool that classroom teachers or administrators can use to see where conversations need to kind of be happening around, right? So there's a couple different sections. There's school policy, right? So you can see the prompts, criteria, questions that are posed here. You kind of go through these and you're like, ooh, no, 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 right? That might be an area in which a courageous conversation needs to be had, right? School organization or administration, kind of look at these criteria and questions. If you feel like we're no, 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 that is another place where a courageous conversation would be useful. School climate and environment. And I like this tool because it's not just focused on race, but you see language here, you see gender identity, you see ability, you see socioeconomic status. So it gives you those intersectional teeth that we need to be comprehensive. There's staffing questions, there's assessment and placement questions, professional learning questions, curriculum questions, right? This might be more applicable to classroom teachers, but just, easy way to kind of self-assess, like, this is what I need to kind of change. This is what I need to work on as a grade level team or chair. This is what we need to work on. We need to have courageous conversations around areas. So again, just another kind of tangible resource that might make this seem a little less overwhelming, because I know that it is. I'll share my screen one more time, and I think Rob dropped my email in the chat, but there it is on the screen again. So I promise I will make these slides available as well as some other resources and get those to the team as soon as possible so we can get those out to you all. So yeah, I hope that wasn't too uncomfortable, too hard.
No,
I do want to be respectful of folks' time.
Well, Sierra, I again, I get the pleasure of working with you on a regular basis, and I will say this, that every time that I hear you talk or we talk as an organization, I feel like I'm able to reflect in a different way and think about things in a different way. And I think that's, if there's any takeaway, it's not that you have all the answers, is that you want us to be thinking about things in a different way. And hopefully folks were able to get some resources out of this. I should mention, the organization that Sierra and I work for is a service organization. And so we would love to be able to help you out. We might not be able to do the work ourselves, but we might know folks in your area of the state who can help you out. as you continue to explore having these courageous conversations. So Sierra, thank you so much for being with us tonight. We'll stick around for just a couple minutes if there's like an individual, like you don't like to ask your question in front of everybody. But I would just remind folks that we'll be back here on March 16th. Jack Berkmeyer will be here as we celebrate middle school level month in March. And so we'll do some recognition of our middle school folks. Josh, do you have any winners for us tonight before we wrap everything up?
Yeah, and I apologize if I mispronounce your name, but I have 2 lucky winners of $20 gift cards to, and that will go Katrina Lubier and Elizabeth Begain.
All right. So we'll get that out to you. And we all know who the big winner was in Kahoot. That was me. So anyway, guys, have a great night. Thank you so much. And we'll see you soon.